Why Japan never attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. On the night of September 15, 1941, a German journalist sat before a radio transmitter in an apartment in the center of Tokyo. His name was Richard Sorg. Behind him stood the man he called his most valuable agent, Ozaki Hatsumi, a Japanese journalist and personal advisor to the Prime Minister of Japan. Ozaki had just returned from Manchuria. He looked at Sorg and spoke 4 words that would change the outcome of the war. The danger has passed. They are not coming. Sorg encoded the message in Morse code and transmitted it to Moscow. Stalin read the dispatch the following morning. That single report would allow him to pull 9 elite divisions, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft from the Far Eastern border and transfer them to the approaches of Moscow, where the Wehrmacht was standing just 25 kilometers from Red Square. But to understand how one intelligence officer and one journalist saved the Soviet Union, we have to go back 2 years, to a battle on the banks of a river that almost no one in the West has ever heard of. May 1939. The Mongolian steppe on the banks of the Khalkhin Gol River. The Japanese Kwantung Army, considered the finest army in Asia, launched an attack on Soviet and Mongolian positions. Japanese officers were confident. The Red Army was weak, demoralized by Stalin's purges, which over 2 years had seen 35,000 officers shot or arrested, including 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union. Taking the Mongolian steppe seemed like an easy task. But on the Soviet side, there arrived a general that few people had yet heard of, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, the same Zhukov who would later stand in the path of the Wehrmacht outside Moscow and Leningrad. Zhukov did not choose to defend. He assembled 58,000 soldiers, 450 tanks, and a massive concentration of artillery, and in August he struck the Japanese positions from 3 sides simultaneously. Japanese losses over 3 months of fighting exceeded 60,000 killed and wounded. Soviet losses stood at around 18,000. General Kometsura Michitaro, commanding the Japanese 23rd Division, personally requested permission to perform ritual suicide. The Japanese general staff refused. Too many losses for such a gesture. But the lesson had been learned. In Tokyo, the conclusion was clear. To go to war with the Soviet Union was to die. All aggression must go south, toward the oil of the Dutch East Indies, toward Singapore, toward French Indochina. This was the birth of the Strike South doctrine, which would ultimately lead Japan to Pearl Harbor. On June 22, 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union. 153 German divisions crossed the Soviet border. In 8 days, the Germans covered the distance from the border to Minsk, 600 kilometers. In the first month of war, Soviet losses in killed, wounded, and captured exceeded 1 million men. In Berlin, Hitler was already commissioning designs for triumphal arches to be built on the site of Moscow. And in Tokyo, the Japanese general staff was once again locked in argument. Strike north or strike south? Because it was precisely then, in July of 1941, that Germany demanded Japan fulfill the terms of the Tripartite Pact and open a second front against the Soviet Union from the east. Japan's Foreign Minister Matsuoka Yosuke, the strongest advocate for the alliance with Germany, was openly demanding an immediate attack. Germany is seizing Russia by the throat from the west. We must strike from the east while she is dying. On July 2, 1941, an imperial conference was convened with Emperor Hirohito himself present, along with all ministers and commanders. It was one of those rare moments when the fate of a war was decided in a single room. General Tanaka Shinichi, chief of the operations section of the General Staff and the leading advocate of the Strike North faction, spoke first. He proposed immediately expanding the Kwantung Army to 25 divisions and attacking the Soviet Far East while the Red Army was bleeding out in the West. At that moment, the Kwantung Army numbered 700,000 men and 14 infantry divisions. Under the Kwantung Plan, the Japanese code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union, The operation envisaged deploying 1,200,000 soldiers, 500 tanks, and 1,200 aircraft. It would have been the largest combined arms operation in Japanese history. General Tanaka was certain. With those forces, the Soviet Far East would fall in 21 days. But others spoke against him. General Sugiyama Hajime, chief of the General Staff, reminded the room of Khalkhin Gol. Admiral Nagano Osami raised a simpler problem: oil. Japan had oil reserves for only 18 months. A war with the Soviet Union in the north would consume everything. But if Japan moved south toward the Dutch oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra, it would secure fuel for decades. Matsuoka and his demand for an immediate attack on the Soviet Union were dismissed mid-conference. On July 15, 1941, he was removed from his post as foreign minister. It was a signal. The Strike North faction had definitively lost. The conference reached a decision that would enter history. It was more advantageous for Japan to wait than to attack. If the Soviet Union collapsed on its own under the German blow, Japan could arrive and take the pieces. If it held, why enter the meat grinder? But that was the official decision. Behind closed doors, General Tanaka continued preparing Kwantung. In July and August of 1941, the Kwantung Army received reinforcements under the cover of special maneuvers, 2 new divisions, the 51st and the 57th, along with hundreds of separate combat units. By August, the Kwantung Army had reached its peak strength: 850,000 men, 140,000 horses, 600 aircraft. Moscow knew this. It was precisely why Stalin could not afford to pull a single division from the Far Eastern border. This was where the story of Richard Sorge began. German by passport, communist by conviction, he had arrived in Tokyo in 1933 as the correspondent of one of Germany's leading newspapers, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. In reality, he was a career officer of Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. Over 8 years in Tokyo, he had become the personal advisor to German Ambassador General Eugenot, so close that he had free access to the embassy's classified documents. In May of 1941, Sorge had warned Moscow about Operation Barbarossa, the date, the direction of the attack, and the number of divisions involved. Stalin dismissed the report at the time, writing in the margin, "Suspicious. File under provocations." But now, in the summer of 41, with the catastrophe already unfolding, that same Sorge had become the only man who could give Stalin an answer to the single most important question: would Japan attack or not? Sorge's most valuable agent inside the Japanese government was Ozaki Hatsumi, a brilliant journalist and analyst serving as an advisor to the cabinet of Prime Minister Kono Fumimaro. This meant Ozaki was present at meetings where the highest military decisions were made. He heard things that no one heard outside a handful of rooms in Tokyo. In late August of 1941, Ozaki traveled to Manchuria under the cover of attending a conference of the South Manchurian Railway Company in the city of Dalian. His real task was to see for himself what was happening with the Kwantung Army. He walked through barracks, spoke with officers, counted equipment on rail sidings. What he saw was decisive. Armored vehicles were not massing near the Soviet border in the north. On the contrary, some units were being transferred to reserve status. The 51st Division had already received orders to redeploy south to China. The oil depots that would need to be full for a winter campaign in the north remained at ordinary levels. Manchuria was not preparing for war with the Soviet Union. It was preparing for something else entirely. Ozaki returned to Tokyo and met with Sorge on September 15th. "The danger has passed. They are not coming," he said. That same night, Sorge encoded and transmitted to Moscow one of the shortest and most important intelligence dispatches of the Second World War. Japan will not attack the Soviet Union in 1941. The main forces will be directed south, against the Dutch East Indies and Thailand. The dispatch reached Moscow within hours. Stalin read it on September 16th. and made the decision that would change the entire course of the war. Through October and November of 1941, troop trains began moving westward from the Soviet-Manchurian border. One after another, Siberian divisions arrived on the Moscow axis, battle-hardened, equipped for winter, accustomed to temperatures of -40 degrees. By December 5th, 9 fresh divisions, 15 rifle brigades, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft from the Far East had concentrated outside Moscow. It was these forces that Zhukov threw into the counteroffensive at dawn on December 5th, 1941. For German soldiers who had already seen the towers of Moscow through their binoculars, this appearance was like a blow from nowhere. General Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group fell back. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army began to withdraw. For the first time in the entire war, the Wehrmacht retreated by as much as 250 kilometers on certain sectors of the front. It was the end of the myth of the Blitzkrieg's invincibility. Sword was arrested by the Japanese police on October 18, 1941, exactly 1 month after his most important dispatch. Ozaki was arrested the same day. Both refused to deny their work for Soviet intelligence. At his trial, Sorg said, "I did this for the sake of peace. German fascism is a catastrophe for humanity." Ozaki said, "I wanted Japan not to perish in this war." Both were executed on the same morning, November 7th, 1944. The very same day on which Moscow held its traditional military parade marking the anniversary of the revolution. Stalin did nothing to save them. He did not even respond to Japanese inquiries about a prisoner exchange. 20 years later, in 1964, the Soviet government posthumously awarded Sorg the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Ozaki received nothing, not in Japan, not in the Soviet Union. His name remained in the archives. So why did Japan never attack the Soviet Union in 1941? The answer comes in 3 layers. The first is Khalkhin Gol. The defeat at the hands of Zhukov in 1939 burned a permanent fear of Soviet armored forces into the Japanese high command. The second is oil. Japan did not have the resources to fight the Soviet Union in the north and simultaneously drive south toward the colonies, and the oil of Borneo mattered more than the forests of Siberia. The third is intelligence. The Sorg operation gave Stalin the confidence that no Eastern Front would open and allowed him to transfer to Moscow precisely the forces he needed to stop the Wehrmacht. Without the dispatch from Tokyo, Moscow might have fallen. Without the defeat at Khalkhin Gol, Sorg would have had no intelligence to gather. And without Zhukov in 1939, there would have been no Zhukov in 1941. History had come full circle. It began on the banks of a river in the Mongolian steppe. It ended at the gates of Moscow.